So yeah, so the title of the seminar is indeed still in Dutch, but this is the single one Dutch slide. So it's about the role of Flemish Jesuits in India in education and development aid. Actually, what we are going to do consists of 4 parts. I will first introduce you to this Jesuit mission in India, or Flemish, Belgian, and then especially Flemish Jesuit mission in India. Aditi will then briefly talk about the Indian population these missionaries were addressing, namely the Adivasi or the tribals. I'll then again take over and will briefly present some current research we are doing regarding these Jesuits, and then especially related to development aid and education. Also importantly, we work on the post-colonial era, so this is the post-1947 era. And then Aditi will conclude by presenting in greater detail her research on Jesuit education in India in the post-independence period, so after 1947. Just a moment. Yeah. Do you see my slides changing? Yeah, you do. So first is the Ranchi Mission. India is huge, as you all know. We are in East India, in the state of Jharkhand, which is colored red here. And Ranchi is the capital of this state. East of Ranchi is the state of West Bengal. And maybe this is also important because the history of the Ranchi mission starts in the late 19th century with the famous Flemish missionary Constant Lievens. However, the history of Belgian Jesuits in India already starts a little earlier, in the 1850s, when Belgian Jesuits were invited by the small community of Catholics in the British Indian capital of Calcutta, present-day Kolkata, the capital of West Bengal, to look for the Catholic worshippers there, and possibly also to proselytize, to convert people there. I mentioned this because in the I today learned just in the conversation before 7 p.m. in the preparation that the great grandfather's brother of Anton Voloshin was one of these early missionaries. These early missionaries were not very successful. Of course, they took care of the Catholics, predominantly Europeans, in Calcutta, but they were not successful in converting other people, which after all was their first objective. However, some of these Jesuits then gradually also went to other places. And Constant Lievens explored tribal area, present-day Jharkhand, and he found strategies to successfully convert greater numbers of local people, of tribal people, of Adivasi, namely by providing judicial assistance in their conflicts with landowners. And this is the reason of why this Constant Lievens can be seen as the founder of a successful mission that continues to exist today. Lievens himself died quite early. He returned to Belgium with a TBC and died in 1892, so only 7 years after the establishment of the mission. But in the following years, other Jesuits, also other fathers, were successful in India. One of the most famous names is the one of Camille Bulke. Later, this is a 20th century missionary who wrote a Hindi-English dictionary and received a huge award for this in the 1970s. This mission, this Belgian or this Flemish mission in India is quite famous. As a matter of fact, India has the greatest number of Flemish or Belgian missionaries after Congo, of course. So, but more than other countries such as China, the Philippines, and so on. Importantly, these were not only Jesuits, these were not only fathers, men, but also sisters, also female missionaries were active in India, in Ranchi and beyond. And so here, just a couple of pictures of sisters to emphasize the importance of female activity as well. By the way, the Jesuits were active in Ranchi, but other mission congregations, female mission congregations, were also active elsewhere. And of course, the most famous ones is the congregations of the Sisters of the Jharkhand, of whom Jeanne de Vos is undoubtedly the most famous sister. When I went to Ranchi for the first time, 2011, so already 10 years ago, there were still 11 Belgian fathers, Belgian missionaries, Belgian Jesuits living there. By now, only 2 of them have left. So all these missionaries died in the course of the last 10 years. Only this one, Mark de Brouwer, and this one, Aurel Bries, are still living in Ranchi and Gumla. Mark de Brouwer is in Gumla. So importantly, the mission is still very active, but all of the Jesuits there now are Indian. And here you see Aditi and another another doctoral student of mine, Rinaldo Souza, in Barway, so the region west of Gumla, west of Ranchi, with some Jesuit fathers. So these are Jesuits. Another picture, not in Ranchi, this is in Jabalpur. Yeah, this is in Jabalpur on an evening, as you see, with whiskey. Fieldwork can be pleasant. This is also among Jesuits. This is not the general idea we here in Europe have of Jesuits, but as many things today, also the Society of Jesus or the Jesuit congregation is globalizing. Today there are about 16,000 Jesuits, and 4,000 of them, so 1/4 of all of the worldwide Jesuits, is Indian. So this also shows the importance of the subject. The mission today, or the Catholic community today in Ranchi, is impressive. This is the cathedral, here empty, but on a Sunday morning, this is full during several masses. It starts in the early morning, 6 a.m., and it goes on till lunchtime. Constant Lievens is buried there. Camille Boulke, so the author of this dictionary, has a street name there. And then there are many institutions, Jesuit institutions, that are built in this neighborhood around the cathedral and Manresa House, which is the main Jesuit residence. Like here, St. Xavier College. This is a college, one of the most reputed colleges in the neighborhood, with here the playing ground and inside. This is a campus map, just to show you how huge this is. There are other institutions, St. Albert's College, which is actually more for seminarians, so for the education of priests. But the building is interesting also because it's huge, and also maybe because it reminds us of the Flemish high schools in, also built by Jesuits. And again, we have female congregations, institutions like St. Anne's Convent or Ursuline Convent, also providing education, but then for girls. So this is a girls' high school. This is Ursuline Intermediate College, and also with the nuns there. These are Ursuline nuns. Ursulines of Tildonk. Tildonk is a place not far from Leuven. So originally a Flemish congregation, but interestingly, this congregation nowadays is led by an Indian system. So also female congregations are being globalized. And another important example, I think, is the congregation of Scheut. So another huge Belgian male congregation, which is now led by a Congolese provincial. Anyway, this Jesuit presence is not limited to Ranchi alone. So you see Ranchi in the upper right area of this map, but this Jesuit province also stretches to other places, both cities, which are the squares, and much more small places. And just to show you a couple of pictures to make you realize what we are talking about. This is St. Ignatius Inter-College in Gumla, so about 200 kilometers west of Ranchi. Then we go further to the west. This is St. Peter's High School in Tongo. St. Xavier's College in Simdika, more to the south, still in construction. So indeed, these schools, this Jesuit province is still expanding today. Not only with colleges, also in villages, like here in Bidi, which is a small village in Barway with just a couple of farms. There are statues here on the very left. You see there a white statue. Well, this is a picture from the front. This is a statue of Constantinus, of the founder missionary, who is still being honored in India today. Interesting, because we are increasingly critical towards colonial activities, but we shouldn't forget that in among local populations in these former missionary areas, there's still much respect and gratefulness for these missionaries. And so this is another picture of the village with on the left, Rinald. It goes further, even in more remote villages, which we could only reach by foot. There are people are active. So these are just a whole series of pictures, not only because it's Friday evening and I think it's good to relax a little bit with pictures, but also because I find it important to give you an idea of what we are actually talking about. I now give the floor to Aditi, who will explain us what Adivasi actually are. Because, well, as I said, these Jesuits especially are active among Adivasi. Aditi, you have the floor.
Yeah, it is, but will you just share the slide or should I share the screen?
This is only one slide for now.
Yeah.
So you just show it and I keep it, and then I'll afterwards we can change.
Okay, yeah. So the Adivasis is a terminology for the indigenous population of India. And before I even begin, even though it may seem like I'm sidetracking a bit, it's important to note that the word Adivasi is very colonial and very problematic in nature, because the Adivasi community constitutes 8% of the total population, and there are more than 200 different types of Adivasis in India. So to group different types of Adivasis who speak different languages with different cultures and different religion into one bracket is already problematic to begin with. But for the sake of convenience and for the lack of any other better term, we Indians and academics continue to use the term Adivasi. So the etymology of Adivasi, Adi means the beginning of anything, and Vasi are the inhabitants. They're also called Vanvasis, which was a term given by the right-wing BJP, which means the land of the forest. And today, Jharkhand is one of has the highest population, or is a state that was created for the Adivasis in 2000, and it today, despite having only 22% of Adivasi population, still is home to the highest population in India. The problem now that arises is that there is a continuation of colonial discourse on Adivasis. And to explain this further, I will backtrack a bit and speak about Adivasis in the colonial period. The British and other missionaries named them as aboriginals, indigenous tribes, backward classes, primitive, and all sorts of colonial anthropological terms. Finally, in the Constituent Assembly, after independence, they were given the term depressed classes for 2 months because they were oppressed to such an extent that the Indian state thought that it was their duty or their moral duty to bring them into mainstream civilized India. And that is why they were given the term scheduled castes. And scheduled castes is because they now belong in the 5th schedule of the Indian Constitution that provides them with certain benefits such as positive discrimination and reservations in the field of education and in the government sector and jobs. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Aditi.
Yeah.
I continue. So yeah, indeed. So Adivasi is a very particular group. It is often being said that they were more eager, more receptive to Christianization because they also believe in one single deity, unlike Hindus who have dozens, hundreds, thousands, even millions of gods and goddesses. But of course, as I said, these Adivasis were also more receptive to the Belgian missionaries because of the latter's assistance in their conflicts with Hindus, with the British also. So what we will do now is just present some preliminary research results. I want to emphasize that, for the past few years, we've been doing a lot of fieldwork with several doctoral students, also with Indian scholars. This is Parimala Rao, who is the co-supervisor, and on the right, she's sitting on the right from JNU, and she's the co-supervisor of Aditi, but also with other doctoral scholars. This is Benjamin Stegen, who's working on the village reconstruction organization, so a development aid organization established by the Flemish Jesuit Michael Windy. Here you see a lot of school children, but the tall guy at the right is Laurens van Haften, who has worked on management schools and will defend his PhD in a month from now, so it's already submitted. Here we have 2 other doctoral students whom you already know by now, Rinald in the middle and then Aditi on the right. Rinald is working on the indigenization of the Jesuit society, so on the Adivasi Jesuits, on the Indian Jesuits by means of their often Hindi sources and periodicals like here Nishkalanka. However, today I will talk about 3, so within this 3rd section, I will talk about 3 different topics we've already published some results about. And again, I'll introduce to the topics by means of pictures and then give some conclusions. And the first one actually links to what Aditi has just said, and that's the representation of Adivasi. So these Jesuits present themselves as the advocates of the Adivasi, as the emancipators, as the ones who assist Adivasi in their development, if I may, but between quotation marks, and in their emancipation, in their integration within Indian society. also in their issues with Indian society, also post-independence. Think of the extraction of natural resources, the dams and so on, but also in their mental emancipation. And a good example of this is the Jharkhand Tribal Museum that was established in Gumla, so in the city 200 kilometers from Ranchi, by a Jesuit development organization, Arouse, which was established by the late Flemish Jesuit Pieter Paul van Nuffel, born in Aalst, who here, as you see, had a dream. This is a poster at the beginning of this tribal museum, a museum in which he wants to highlight, he and the Jesuits, the Adivasis, Jesuits he constructed this museum with. He wants to highlight the culture, the living customs, the habit, the way of living, kitchen, bedroom, but also the world views, the foundational myths of all of these different tribes. Here he lists the Orans, the Karias, the Mundas, the Santas, and the Hos. For instance, here, as I said, believing in a single deity. This is about the creation of the world. And this museum highly contrasts the mainstream views of mainstream Indian views of Adivasi. As Aditi has already said, this has colonial roots, but is being further fueled by Hindu nationalists, BJP, and so on. If you go to other museums in Ranchi, here in Calcutta, so the Indian Museum of 1814, more than 200 years old museum in Calcutta, well, there the representation, the display of Adivasi is completely different. They just have these statues, these windows, these scenes of separate, of individual tribes, allegedly distinguishing them among each other, but as a matter of fact, as Aditi already said, also putting them under the same umbrella of primitivity and backwardness. And so here you see just a scene from the life from one particular tribe. On top you can read it in Bengali, Bangla, in English and in Hindi. These are Garo. And then you have a map where those Garo lived. These are the Chenchu, and again emphasizing primitivity, connectedness with nature, and so on. And always a map. The Santal in Jharkhand, highlighting some particularities, if there are any, because of course, many of these Adivasi wear similar clothes, have music instruments, are close to nature and so on. But just as in the colonial era, the present-day India lists them, distinguishes all of these different tribes, the Khasi, and so on and so forth. Even with heads, yeah, anyway. Now, in one article, Benjamin, Arjun Sharma, another postdoc now, and I compared two different museums. So this tribal museum in Gumla, established by this Belgian missionary in 2005, and then another one in Ranchi, founded in 2008 by an Indian institute, the Jharkhand Tribal Welfare Research Institute. We conclude that both museums present a reductive interpretation of Adivasi culture. So both of them characterize Adivasi as static remnants from a primitive past, neglecting their cultural diversity, sophistication, religious heterogeneity, and political development. However, the missionary museum, so the Jesuit museum in Gumla, also uses an emancipatory discourse, emphasizing the injustices suffered by tribal communities, or their political struggles and achievements in past and present times, and accordingly also grants Adivasi a place in their own history as well as political agency. And so the conclusion is ambiguous. On the one hand, we still have find this reductive interpretations of tribal Adivasi culture, but there's also this emancipatory discourse. And I just give some more examples of the museum in Gumla. For instance, here with the Chotanagpur Tenancy Act, the Magna Carta of the Jharkhand tribal inalienable birthright to ownership of water, forest, and land where they dwell. This, of course, contrasts these claims by the Indian government on the land, on the water, for dams, for mines, and so on. Also, the way how this this missionary museum contrasts the tribals and the non-tribals may be seem idealistic. So dominating non-tribals versus liberating tribals, status quo versus mobility. Also political and authority ranging from the despotic to democratic, while tribals are alleged to always have been democratic. Majority decisions, consensus decisions, centralized, decentralized. And then economy and ecology, resources used as capital as a means of production versus resource used as a means of livelihood and need-based production, and so on. So this contrast. But also this emancipatory aspects. Here, for instance, this is a picture from a room with famous Adivasi, either resistance fighters or people who served in the Indian army, giving in this way important figures, heroes, history to the Adivasi. Another room is full of Adivasi art, also, and not the classic, the tribal art and craft, but modern art to show that Adivasi also have these cultures. So this is a first topic we've worked on. A second topic is on the development aid, as I already mentioned, on the missionary development aid, Jesuit development aid, present day often called faith-based development aid. So development aid, I don't need to introduce you to the history of development aid, but you know that this originates actually from missionary activities, and many of the of today's most famous Belgian or Flemish development organizations, such as Damien Action, or Broederlijk Delen, or Vredeseilanden, and so on, are actually based in missionary activities, and also were founded immediately after or in the era of, let's say, around 1960, so in the era of decolonization. So, whereas, as a matter of fact, a new form of missionary activity in the then Third World. Jesuits, after 1960, so the last generation of Belgian missionary or Flemish missionaries of Jesuits in Ranchi, also established several of these development aid organizations. I already mentioned Arouse by Pieter Paul van Uffel, which actually is the abbreviation of Animation, rural outreach service and has several offices and several projects all over Barway, Jharkhand, so the region of Gumla. With this is again in Gumla with the research center of seeds and plants, the cultivation of silk, and then the assistance in producing textile and so on. So this is one of these organizations. Another one, and maybe even more famous, at least among certain people, is the project, the life projects of another Flemish Jesuit, namely Vic van Bortel, who died already in the early 21st century, but maybe interesting for today's seminar, got an honorary doctorate from the University of Antwerp a few years before his death, I think in the early 21st century, precisely because of his life achievement. And this is the project of Kishornagar, the city of boys. This is a development, this is a project that he established in 1969, so already more than 50 years ago. And it's a project in which he raises boys without much chances, without great perspectives, from a young age to adulthood. So he organizes education, he gives them accommodation, he also builds kitchens, bathrooms. Actually, those boys live there, spend their childhood there, spend many years there, are being trained, get education, and in this way are being prepared for future life. On an average, nowadays, there are about 600 boys living there. So this is a huge number. And every year there are many more candidates than this project of Kishornagar can actually accept. So some pictures of this Kishornagar. This is the room near the bedroom. Every boy has a box with all his private belongings. This is on the playground. As you see, yeah, they're watching TV. So the means are still quite poor to our standards, but yeah, these boys seem very happy. This is the kitchen. Oh, sorry. This is, yeah. So this is the kitchen. So the boys also cook their own food, of course. Everybody in his turn, but for the whole community, of course, being assisted by adults, and all of this being led by the Jesuit, initially for more than 40 years by this Vic van Bortel, later then after his death by Louis Franken. Louis Franken died last year. Now it's being taken over by an Indian Jesuit. Another example of this faith-based development aid, of this Jesuit development aid in Ranchi, is the organization, or is the Village Reconstruction Organization, VRO, which was established by Michael Windy, another Flemish Jesuit from Buggenhout. The name sounds a little English, but it's Flemish. And I still wonder whether Flo Windy, a young celebrity now in Flanders, is a relative of Michael Windy. Anyway, Michael Windy in 1955 established XISS, Xavier Institute of Social Sciences. I'll come back to that in the next section. But then later in the 1960s, created a spin-off. So also left Ranchi, left Jharkhand, went more to the south, and created a new organization, the Village Reconstruction Organization. As the name suggests, this is an organization to build new villages, initially after natural disasters, but then later also on other occasions. Started in the late 1960s, somehow declined in the 70s, but as you see, this then again boomed from the late 1970s onward, and especially in the 1990s and the noughties. This was a very impressive organization that got support from a huge number of international, especially European donors, both in Belgium and beyond, Switzerland, Germany, and so on. And so Benjamin Stegen is doing a PhD on this. Unfortunately, all of this research, I should emphasize, has been hampered by COVID-19. We haven't been able to go to India for the last 2 years. But anyway, this is another ongoing project. We already published, so Benjamin and I, along with a colleague from HIVA, so the Hoger Instituut voor de Arbeid, also in Leuven, published an article on religion and development, and on faith-based development cooperation. So the idea is, so this was about the role of religion in development. What I've shown right now, so these examples of Arouse and Kishore Nagar and the VRO, the Village Reconstruction Organization, are examples of missionary, of Jesuit organizations, forms of development aid, but are not the only ones. As a matter of fact, there are many more also related to the church, also established by religious people. And then over the past 10, 20 years, the importance of this faith-based development aid, the importance of religion in development, is increasingly being emphasized in scholarly literature, in development studies. So often emphasizing the advantages, the benefits, the virtues of faith-based actors, faith-based development aids. In the West, we are secularized. We would underestimate religion. But in the global South, religion is central in the public as well as private sphere. And so, the importance of faith-based development aid can be that it actually acknowledges, even starts from religion, or gives a huge place to religion in development aid, and therefore has certain advantages. And so a wide range of virtues are attributed to faith-based actors, demonstrating their capacity for more effective, efficient, and relevant development work. Faith-based organizations are applauded for, among other things, their attention to holistic development, the incorporation of moral and spiritual aspects of well-being as an alternative to mainstream secular development, their capacity to engender trust, legitimacy, commitment, to motivate and mobilize donors, volunteers, staff, communities, their cultural proximity and responsiveness to poor communities, their long-established local and international networks, the church, facilitating effective and efficient service delivery. Yeah. Having said this, we also emphasize that most of these benefits supposedly distinguish FBOs, so faith-based organizations, from their secular counterparts, but actually have to do more with aspects of embeddedness and informality in relation to communities than to religious identity. Moreover, the tendency in the literature to commend faith-based development is reflected in the relatively sparse attention given to critiques of faith-based organizations and the risks of incorporating religion in development in general. Possible drawbacks like proselytism, preferences for same faith beneficiaries and the exclusion of others, and the conservative or roundabout handling of issues like gender and sexuality are often mentioned but rarely examined in depth. So what we did in this article was we examined how 8 Belgian development NGOs perceive the importance of incorporating religion in their own development practice. And we came to the conclusion that they highlight a number of benefits and drawbacks related to their own religious profile. But the ground level detail adds also nuance and questions the validity of a clear-cut dichotomy between faith-based and secular NGOs and the instrumentalizing language of comparative advantages. So, as a matter of fact, we argue that a deeply empirical contextualized approach is needed, and that this dichotomy, this black and white representation between faith-based and secular development organization may be too strong. Then a third topic I want to discuss today is, and then I'll give the floor to Aditi, is the one of Jesuit management schools. So indeed, this can also be seen as a matter of fact, education can be seen as a kind of development aid. But a very particular one are the management schools. And then also in East India, in Ranchi. So as I already said, the ex-ISS, the Xavier Institute for Social Service, was established in 1955. This wasn't even the first management school. Maybe it's something more than management, social service. This is for emancipation. This is more development oriented than management, which is close to business schools. But another one of these higher education schools with a particular profile, an earlier one, is XLRI in Jamshedpur, the Xavier Labor Relations Institute. And then this goes on. XIM, Xavier Institute for Management, was established in Bhubaneswar, the capital of the state of Odisha, in 1987. And then XIDAS, Xavier Institute for Development and the abbreviation, Development Action and Service, was created in Jabalpur, which is more or less in the middle of India. On the left of this map, but in the middle of the whole of India. First, some pictures. This is Xavier Institute of Social Service in Ranchi. This is the Xavier Institute of Management in Bhubaneswar, with a lot of campuses. I'll come back to this. Important is just here that is the role of Father Michael van den Boogaard, again, a Flemish missionary from Willebroek, who's still being remembered there with a residence at the Father Boogaard residence. I'll come back to this figure in a minute. This is then XIDAS in Jabalpur, where the same Van den Boogaard is also being celebrated, even remembered to a greater extent. His tomb is there. You see his tomb in front. And then behind, more to the right, his statue as a modern Francis of Assisi feeding pigeons. But also in the entrance, there's this bust. There's a Boogaard museum with pictures and other personal belongings of Van den Boogaard. What did we do for now? And this is especially Laurens van Haften's research regarding these management schools. Well, Laurens has studied the history, has taken a greater look in greater detail on the history of these management institutions, and he's already published a chapter on the Xavier Institute of Management in Bhubaneswar, so one of these institutions. And yeah, the history tells a different tale than is often being heard here in Belgium. We would associate this with Michael van den Boogaard, but Laurens shows that many more actors were involved in this, not only Belgian Jesuits, but also Indian actors, not only Jesuits, but also secular ones, non-Christian Indians. As a matter of fact, the idea of establishing such a business school came from the chief minister of Odisha, who Odisha is a poor state, and the chief minister wanted an institute of management in order to give a boost to the economy. He then invited the then director of XLRI, so this first management school from the 1940s in Jabalpur, sorry, in Jamshedpur, Romuald de Souza, who initially didn't want to come, but eventually came to Bhubaneswar and developed the idea of establishing this management institute along with the CM, with the chief minister of Odisha. Not all of the Jesuits were enthusiastic about this, because this management institute would first and foremost serve the elite, while many Jesuits actually were especially concerned about the poor, wanted to do more social work than economic education. And especially in the neighboring Jesuit province of Ranchi, there was protest, especially among the Adivasi. Romuald de Souza is a Jesuit from Goa, so from another part of India, and with a different background. Eventually, Van den Boogaard, the then director of XISS, moved to Bhubaneswar, but then the question is also in what circumstances, and we presume that he actually had to leave Ranchi because he was involved in a protest against the construction of a dam, and a year earlier another Belgian Jesuit was expelled from India, had to leave India. So anyway, Van den Boogaard also went to Bhubaneswar, and then there were many conflicts, or at least disagreements between those two views and those two leading figures of Romuald de Souza, an Indian, and Michael van den Boogaard, the Flemish Jesuit. De Souza advocating management education, Van den Boogaard, aiming to develop social service, social work. Problems involved was that de Souza was close to the government of Odisha, and that he did not want foreign money, foreign funds to be involved in this project, because this would jeopardize his relation with Odisha, with the government of Odisha. Van den Boogaard then founded a new institute within this XIM, within this Xavier Institute of Management, Senderet, a Center for Research and Development, which attracted a lot of foreign funds. and eventually outgrew the XIM, albeit being part of it. So after a couple of years, there was more staff working for this Centret, part of the Xavier Institute of Management, than for Xavier Institute Management itself. Eventually, both Jesuits left. Van den Boogaard went to Jabalpur, where he then founded Xidas, and eventually would also be buried, spent the last years of his life there, while Romuald de Souza went to Goa and had built a career over there. But what this case beautifully shows are the different agendas, the different ideas about what Jesuits should do in India, the different means also, and the power relations. Van den Boogaard had more money, being funded by Western donor agencies. Romuald de Souza, on the contrary, was backed by the Indian government. And then you can ask yourself, what is then the role of these Western donor agencies, who often do not know the background of the situation in India. So eventually this story calls us to open the eyes for local contexts in development. The chapter is part of a volume that appeared this year, Missionary Education, Historical Approaches and Global Perspectives, that I co-edited with a colleague of History of Education and Kim Christiansen, the director of KADOK, and in which there's also a chapter I wrote along with Aditi and Rinald on Jesuit education in Ranchi, India after 1950. But I think it's now time to give the floor to Aditi, and Aditi will now present her research in greater detail. Aditi, I'll stop sharing and you'll take over. Is that okay? Or do you want me just to follow and to go to the next slide as soon as you say so? What would you prefer? Or you should unmute yourself.
Yeah, maybe if you can continue sharing and then.
Yeah, okay, and you just say when I should change.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, here you go.
Yeah. Hello again. Yeah, so this topic of the evolution of Jesuit schools in Jharkhand, I must give a full disclaimer that I had no idea that the Belgian Jesuits were even involved in India. We did not study that in history. It was mostly the Portuguese missionaries that we always learned about, but the Belgians, and in this case, especially the Flemish Jesuits and the impact that they had in Jharkhand, present-day Jharkhand, back then it was called Bihar, was extremely surprising. And why did we choose Jharkhand, or why did Idisbal choose Jharkhand? He may have had his own reasons, but the way I look at it is missionary schools in India are very sought after by members of the left, by members of the right, and everyone in between. Everyone wants to put their kid into a mission school. In Indian colloquial terms, it's called as a convent school because the school is in a convent. And many of these schools, especially from my home state of Maharashtra and other states even, mission schools usually contain or are given to members of the elite. And Jharkhand, therefore, presents as a very interesting case study because the Flemish actually went into the deep tribal belts where the British Raj at that time did not want to go, or even today, the Indian state does not want to go. And hence the first, how do we put it, the first smell or the taste of education given to the Adivasis, Western education, of course, was obviously not the Jesuits. It was first the Lutheran mission, but the expansion and the manner of expansion that we've seen has been the credit does go to the Flemish Jesuits and then the Walloon Jesuits in Calcutta. And hence, this is why I think that Jharkhand, the region of Jharkhand and even Bihar is extremely interesting, because missionaries, especially in India, that fell prey to the Indian social structure, especially the caste system, chose willingly to enter these extremely highly forested areas in the 18th and the 19th century. Yeah, it can change this, please. Yeah, this is the St. Mary's School in Simdaga, and we had gone for field work here with Idisbal almost 3 years ago, and I remember being very sick. I think Idisbal also. It was very cold, and the rooms we were put were very dusty. So yeah, we were not in a great shape. But I think that this photo is extremely interesting, not just for my thesis, but also for the viewers. If you just look at the picture, this is a classic morning of every Indian school. Students from all grades gather down in the main play area, and then you're meant to recite a prayer, and the Indian pledge, and then the Indian national anthem. And this is in a way done every day religiously to sort of instill a sense of patriotism and love for your country. And this photo, if you see the person leading the prayers and the assembly, as we call it, is a Jesuit, a Christian, that a community that is now not much liked by the right-wing government. But we must stop here and already move back and say that this is not entirely true. It is not just in 2021 that Christians are facing a problem. The attitude and the mentality towards Christians and Christian missionaries already changed in 1947. The Congress government at the time that ruled the country till around the late 1980s was also responsible for creating this change of mentality, even though the Jesuits and other missionaries tried their very best to say we are equally Indian. And this is actually what I will discuss in one of my chapters, as to how they use education to promote their idea of nationhood, nationality, and citizenship. Yes. Next slide, please. But of course, before we get to my chapters, Idisbal always says I should present as if the viewers don't know anything, and I struggle with that. So if you have questions, please later. The history, so it's important to look at the history of mission history, and I don't know the reasons why, but it has mostly been written by armchair Western authors, not surprising. And the focus, especially in India, on missionaries in India has always been on Protestants. I also don't know the reason for this, but my wild guess can be that Protestants were much better in record keeping, and also the pre-independence pre-independence era of India, where missionaries were mostly European, meticulously maintained records of their activities. And hence, we come to the third point, where a lot of mission history is written by missionaries themselves. So it is actually just a lot of work is an over-glorified book on how they were the first masters to enter into this region, where Indians or that indigenous community knew absolutely nothing. And now that it was their moral duty to show them the light. And for the fourth point, the post-colonial period is largely understudied. We don't know why, apart from the reasons of maybe there wasn't record keeping, but I also think that the reason for this could be that the missionary influx into India reduced after 1947, because the new Indian government stopped issuing visas to European missionaries. And before we go ahead, all this seems that Christianity or missionary history is quite new to India. But no, Christianity in India is not much older than Christianity itself, because Saint Thomas, one of the apostles of Jesus, entered India in I think 52 AD. But his purpose was not that of a missionary. Christianity then did not spread. It was only in the year 1510 when the Vatican gave permission to the Portuguese king to send what we call now as anthropologists, who are also missionaries, to spread the word of the gospel. So the spread of Christianity in India was only in the late 14th, early 15th century. And it was mostly concentrated in southern India and western India. And the first converts were actually upper caste, Indian upper caste Brahmins, which is why I come back to the point that Jharkhand is an interesting study, because Christians themselves did not want the backward castes of Hindus to come into their fold. And we know that Adivasis do not like to be called Hindus. They have their own religions. It's mostly an animalistic religion, but Hindus, the Hindu community, like to get them into mainstream Indian fold. Yes. There are several scholarly debates on missionary history, and the most sought after or the most popular one is of the missionaries and the colonial enterprise. And this debate is as old as, let's say, again, mission history itself, because were missionaries responsible for imperialism? Were missionaries responsible for colonialism? And there is no straight answer to this, but we must begin with defining colonialism itself. I think there is a big misunderstanding that colonialism is largely a military enterprise, and that's why we think of the British in India as the colonialists, and then we call the missionaries, who might be soft agents of colonialism, but they're not colonialists themselves. Colonialism also entails into 5 different aspects, such as cultural colonialism or social colonialism. And all this is not brought by just military conquering a country. We must remember that the British were largely uninterested in India with terms of religion. They let the Indians pretty much do what they want, and their relation with other missionaries, including the Jesuits, was not always friendly. But the debate in India, the missionary history debate in India, has 2 poles. One is the traditional missionary historian that will go into the theology of missionaries and say this was the ultimate goal of missionaries, and in a way will glorify. And the other pole, according to this historian called Peter van der Weeg, he says that the other pole is secular, who tries to look at this debate in a very objective manner, but still somehow manages to ignore the relations of power. And this struck home to me, because at a presentation, I was given a feedback by my other supervisor, and she said, your presentation is all fine, but why don't you talk about how missionaries suffered at the hands of the Indian government? And while she thought that her objective was purely that her research was purely objective, she still had an agenda. She still had the Indian secular agenda of free propagation of religion, and she wanted that to enter my research. But that this approach is dangerous, because then you forget the power relations that missionaries had towards their new converts, because we must remember the converts were not treated as equals. The converts were still backward, primitive, especially in this case, the Adivasis were still backward and primitives. They were perceived as not knowing what they want. And the only way to sort of uplift them, the goal was upliftment and not emancipation, was to show them the light and show them the gospel. And in several other debates, colonial observers would say that missionaries have documented several instances of excessive male domination in their regions, and we find this frequently in Jesuit circulars of education documents, where they say we need to educate the boys, because back then only boys were being sent to school. We need to educate the boys and civilize them. But then the question remains to be asked, is this sort of charity mission only a tool for the colonialization, or is it just pure out of goodwill? And these are some of the debates that revolve around missionaries and colonialism in India. Of course, colonialism varies from country to country, and we cannot generalize it for the entire global South. Coming from the colonial enterprise to constructive Orientalism, as the big famous word of work of Edward Said, constructive Orientalism, and one of tribal authors called Joseph Bara uses in his work, where he says Christianity is brought into Southern religions, or tribal religions in this case, to perfect native religions. And there is a sort of a deceiving nature where Bara argues that missionaries enter a particular region and they convince the people that they are, for example, miserable, and then they say Christianity will remove you out of this. And in this way, missionaries, even if they are Indian or if they're European, the goal of civilization remains. And that is why I made the point before that the colonial discourse of the treatment of Adivasis, or the perception towards Adivasis, continues. Further, I would also like, or I will look at the politics of representation and also redistribution. And this was a term coined by Kamath and Matthew in their work, where she gives an example of a Kerala Christian school in India, but which is highly applicable to education in Jharkhand. The politics of redistribution is in fact using education in an attempt to correct inequalities and in social powers between religious groups. So in this case, we are talking about the suppressed Adivasis in their own land with regards to land grabbing, in construction of dams, or inadequate compensation of the state. And this, in the diaries of the inspector of Catholic schools in Jharkhand, it's frequently mentioned as to how education can be used as a tool to empower and uplift and to correct, as I said, to correct inequalities, to educate the Adivasi community that they are being oppressed. And this is how they wanted to use education. The other side of the politics of redistribution is actually the politics of recognition, which is also used in education, where the dominant culture or the dominant religion of that region thinks that tribal or the Adivasis were opportunistic and hence converted into Christianity, which is not really the case, factually speaking. Adivasis converted because they were being oppressed by the mainstream Hindus. And hence the politics of recognition actually relies upon the authoritative monolism of the so-called native. And this is where we would also discuss as to who is the native. Is the Adivasi the native in Jharkhand? Is the education provided to Adivasi from their perspective, or do we adhere to the dominant native or the Hindu native narrative of the Hindu natives? I'm sorry, I want to repeat that sentence. Or is it the dominant narrative of what Hindus consider as native? And education, as you can see, there is one. It has been mentioned 5 times since 1957, where the government appointed school inspector has accused the Jesuits of teaching religion in their schools outside of school hours. So the rule in India currently since 1947 is that religious education should be taught outside of school hours and should not be graded. But the accusation here is that Catholicism was in fact being taught in school hours. There were exams being conducted, and hence the Indian state and the state government accused the Jesuits of holding mass conversions for instance, and also of Catholicizing the Adivasis. And as a punishment, which the Jesuits themselves call in their diaries a punishment, today Catholic Adivasis are no longer considered Adivasis. You are an Adivasi if you're from the Santal community, and not if you converted to Islam or Christianity. And hence there is this debate. We can see in this politics of representation, there is a fight for identity. Which identity is truly Indian? And we see the Jesuits in their sources struggling with this, because on the one hand, Jesuit schools from Jharkhand, they have sent tens of players into, for example, the Indian national hockey team, who have won consecutive Olympic medals. But at the same time, you have the Indian state that is saying that Christianity is a foreign religion in India, and we should clamp down on them in those very words. The last concept that I would like to discuss is religion as a brick, because this was coined by a sociologist called Danielle Hervieux-Léger, a French sociologist, where she argues that religion, as believed in the modern world, is actually not disappearing; it is just transforming. And the duty of and the goal of Catholic education is to, in fact, maintain Catholicity of schools. And Catholic education is to provide to a Catholic child only. And this is where, again, we see in Jesuit sources where missionaries them are debating amongst themselves whether to admit non-Catholic students. Because will this, if you admit non-Catholic students, will this affect, yes, first the greater demographic on the school, and will this also affect the larger Catholicity of schools? Another example in 1987 was with regards to which holiday should be given to a Catholic school, because in India you're given holidays for Christmas and other traditional Hindu holidays, but the head of Jesuit education, the Jesuit Educational Association, wrote to the state government saying, we want holidays, for example, for Easter, for Good Friday, and other Catholic occasions. But of course, this was denied. And here you see the struggle of transformation, because religion, according to Léger, is a chain of memory. And a memory can only be collective if you allow that community to create it continuously. And the Jesuits see it in a way, they see the admission or the admitting of non-Catholic students as a threat to end this collective memory. Now, is this argument flawed? In a way, yes, because there will always be a conflict between the Catholicism of Vatican and the Catholicism of, let's say, Jharkhand. And in a way, there is a disparity, because the social identification of an Adivasi Catholic will always be different from a social identification of a European Jesuit that may have first converted them, or the education that was first provided to them. Yeah, next. Yeah, and then hence comes the research questions. How did mission education evolve in post-colonial era? Jesuit missionaries had a lot to deal with after 1947. For example, yes, the very most important example is the relationship with the state. So the larger Indian state and their educational policies, the position within local society, how were Catholics perceived in a majority Hindu state? They also had to deal and evolve with perception and attitudes towards modernizing education. Did the policy documents suggest that they had to let go, or they let go of the main goal that was evangelization a long time ago, and now the goal was just to impart education? And the last one is the importance of religion, where, yes, the debate that I already mentioned, whether religion should be taught in schools or not. How important is teaching Catholicity important to maintain the Catholicism in Jharkhand? Yeah. Yes. And yeah, as already mentioned, the case study, yeah, the sources, the original idea was to use a mix of primary sources and conduct fieldwork in Jharkhand, but that fieldwork definitely hit a roadblock due to COVID. But thanks to Idisbald and also Benjamin, who took thousands of photos in 2016 of several of booklets and pamphlets and school year books and jubilee books. With the help of these, I will be using these current sources, such as published periodicals, such as the Ranchi Bulletin. It was first published in 1939, but we have records and access from 1942 to 2010. The main goal of this bulletin is actually an internal discussion between several Jesuits on several issues, in this case, education, conversion, what is Christianity, etc. The second one are clergy meetings, where members of the Jesuit community congregate once a year and discuss the policy that would be implemented in that current year. Then you also have books published by Jesuits, and this, of course, is a bit, I would not say dangerous, but is a bit of a hassle if you want to refer to objective work. Books published by Jesuits is not always objective, and this is where I am currently struggling to keep a neutral outlook, because Jesuits always talk as if they are the Jharkhand Jesuits, especially. There is a perception that they were the first missionaries to enter Jharkhand ever, and they were the first ones to do everything. And it is important that I take a step back, look at other sources, which has not always been easy to find, and present matters factually. Government sources, of course, has also been quite difficult, but I do have the Bihar Manual of Education, where you have the actual education policy of that year, and I have access from 1969 to 1978. And the last source, one of the other last sources, is yearbooks, school yearbooks. That is a very common tradition in Indian schools, where every year students and alumni and famous politicians contribute to the quote unquote yearbook of that school, where the nature is more reminiscent, where they speak of how this school has contributed to an XYZ community, and the goals that it should reach in the future.